Picture the streets of Rome in the year 67 AD. The sun is bright, the marble buildings gleam, and the air hums with the noise of merchants, beggars, and senators moving through the forum. Among the bustle, a sudden silence spreads as heads turn in unison. The emperor himself has arrived. Nero, draped in splendor, strides with the confidence of a man who believes the world exists for his gaze alone. At his side walks a bride. She glitters with jewels and silk, her face delicate and composed, every movement graceful enough to silence the crowd. To any stranger, she would appear to be the Empress of Rome, radiant and untouchable. But whispers ripple through the people who know the truth. This bride is not who she seems. Her name is Sporus, and not long ago he was a young boy in the palace household. Now he stands at the emperor's side, reshaped, renamed, and displayed as though he were the shadow of another. This is not only a tale of Rome's excess, it is the story of how grief can twist into madness, how obsession can erase another person's life, and how power, without limits, can transform human beings into instruments of fantasy. The fate of Sporus will echo far beyond Nero's reign, haunting history as one of its darkest and most unforgettable tragedies.
Nero was not always the monster remembered in history. When he first came to power in the year 54 AD, he was only 16 years old. To the Roman people, his youth promised a new era, a chance for renewal after years of rigid rule. His first actions seemed to confirm their hopes. He lowered taxes, provided games and entertainments for the masses, and even appeared on stage as a performer, something no emperor had dared to do before. The people cheered, delighted to see their ruler among them. For a brief moment, it felt as if Rome stood at the threshold of a golden age. Senators tolerated his eccentricities, the common people adored him, and poets compared him to Apollo himself. Nero seemed to relish the role of a young, generous emperor who gave Rome both bread and spectacle. But absolute power carries its own poison. With every decision, with every decree, Nero stood alone. No one could correct him, no one could challenge him, no one dared to say he was wrong. Over time, that silence became a cage, and inside that cage, his mind began to warp. By the middle of the 60s AD, paranoia gnawed at him. Enemies seemed to lurk in every shadow. Rumors of plots and conspiracies swirled in the streets and in the palace. Nero grew restless, suspicious, and increasingly detached from reality. The boy who once promised Rome a brighter future was already sliding into the darkness that would define his name for centuries. And then, in the midst of this decline, he met the woman who would capture his heart and ignite the obsession that shaped everything that followed. Her name was Poppaea Sabina.
Poppaea Sabina was unlike anyone Nero had ever known. Ancient writers described her beauty in superlatives, claiming no words could capture the way she carried herself. But she was not only admired for her appearance, she was intelligent, ambitious, and skilled in the subtle art of Roman politics. She knew how to win favor, how to bend situations to her advantage, and how to make herself indispensable. At the time, Nero was married to Octavia, the daughter of the former emperor. Octavia was quiet, dutiful, and reserved. She fulfilled her role with grace, but little warmth, her life bound to politics rather than love. Poppaea was her opposite in every sense. Where Octavia faded into the background, Poppaea demanded the spotlight. Where Octavia avoided attention, Poppaea thrived on it. Nero was instantly drawn to her. What began as a scandalous affair soon burned into an obsession that even his closest advisors feared. He showered Poppaea with gifts more extravagant than any empress had received before. Silks from the East,
perfumes from Arabia, gemstones that glittered brighter than the torches of his banquets. Yet gifts were not enough. Nero stationed guards to follow her, not so much to protect as to monitor. His desire for her was no longer love, but possession. To Nero, Poppaea was not simply a woman, she was the embodiment of everything he wanted: beauty, brilliance, and the promise of eternal glory. His infatuation drove him to take a step that shocked Rome. He divorced Octavia, despite the outrage it stirred, and declared his intention to marry Poppaea in a ceremony of unprecedented splendor. The wedding was dazzling, the palace filled with roses, lamps, and music from every province of the empire. Nero displayed her not only as his bride, but as proof of his power, his ability to remake reality as he wished. For a time, it seemed his obsession was complete. But Poppaea was not like the courtiers who bowed and flattered. She was bold, unafraid to voice her thoughts. And in that fearlessness lay the seeds of tragedy.
Once Poppaea became Empress, Nero's devotion turned darker. The marriage did not calm his obsession, it inflamed it. He surrounded her with attendants who owed their positions entirely to him, creating a circle of loyalty that kept her isolated from family and friends. Wherever she went, eyes followed. To the outside world, it appeared to be protection, but in truth, it was surveillance. He filled his private chambers with her image. Sculptors carved her likeness in marble. Painters captured her face on panels of wood and plaster. Jewelers crafted cameos and ornaments engraved with her profile. Nero could not bear to be apart from her, even for an hour. When Poppaea was not physically present, her portrait stared back at him from every wall. The emperor's passion was not partnership. It was ownership. He treated her not as a woman with her own mind, but as a possession he had conquered. Yet Poppaea was too clever to ignore the danger of this devotion. She used his infatuation to secure influence for her family, weaving her own network of allies within the court. She understood that her position, as powerful as it seemed, was also perilous. Unlike the others who bowed to Nero's moods, Poppaea refused to surrender her independence. She criticized his artistic pursuits, argued with him over politics, and even mocked his performances when they failed to impress. To her, Nero was still a man, not a god. But to Nero, who ruled 60 million subjects and faced no contradiction from anyone else, her defiance cut deeply. The palace grew heavy with tension. Behind the glittering walls of banquets and triumphs, arguments flared, tempers rose, and the fragile line between passion and destruction grew thinner each day. It was during one of these quarrels that the tragedy struck, a moment that would forever break Nero and set Sporus on his path.
The year was 65 A.D. Poppaea was pregnant, carrying what could have been Nero's heir. Yet her courage to challenge him did not soften. Ancient accounts differ on the cause of the quarrel. Some say she accused him of caring more for his theater than for his empire. Others whisper it began after he returned late from the circus, intoxicated with applause and careless of her condition. Whatever the spark, the fire that followed was devastating. The argument grew louder, sharper, until Nero's temper snapped. In a moment of fury, he lashed out. The details are uncertain, but the result was clear. Poppaea collapsed, her body broken, her unborn child lost with her. Servants rushed, physicians were summoned, but nothing could undo what had been done. By nightfall, the Empress of Rome was dead. Imagine the silence that followed.
The emperor who commanded legions, who could order the death of any senator with a word, now knelt beside the body of the woman he loved most. Ancient writers say he wept, begging her to forgive him, ordering her to live, as if his power could bend death itself. He promised physicians wealth beyond measure if they saved her, threatened them with torment if they failed. None of it mattered. With Poppaea gone, Nero was left not only with grief, but with guilt. The weight of his violence pressed down on him, and something inside him cracked. His sorrow did not bring him closer to reality. Instead, it drove him further from it. What began as mourning soon became madness. Nero could not accept Poppaea's death. He refused the Roman custom of cremation, instead ordering her body to be embalmed and placed in a grand tomb more splendid than those of emperors before him. He declared her divine, built shrines in her honor, and forced courtiers to speak of her as though she still lived. At banquets, her seat was left empty, a constant reminder that the emperor expected her presence, even in absence. The palace became a theater of shadows. Ministers, servants, and senators all played their parts, pretending Poppaea's spirit remained at Nero's side. To contradict this fiction was dangerous. Those who urged him to move on found themselves exiled or executed. Nero himself spoke to her embalmed body, whispering to it as if it could reply. In his mind, she was not gone, merely waiting to be restored. Grief had twisted into delusion, and delusion into obsession. The empire trembled under the weight of his fantasies, yet no one dared to tell the emperor that he had lost touch with reality. It was in this strange and haunted atmosphere that Nero's eyes fell upon a youth within the palace. His name was Sporus. He was young, perhaps 15, raised in the household and known for his delicate features. What caught Nero's attention was not his talent or his service, but his face. Sporus resembled Poppaea in a way that startled everyone who saw it. His eyes, his bone structure, even his expression seemed to echo hers. To Nero, it was not a coincidence, it was fate. Here before him was the answer to his grief, the chance to bring back what he had destroyed. Sporus became the canvas upon which the emperor would try to paint his lost love back into existence. And so began a transformation that would forever erase the life the boy had once known.
The first time Nero truly looked at Sporus after Poppaea's death, it was as if a door opened in his fractured mind. The boy's resemblance to the late Empress was undeniable, and to Nero, it felt like destiny. He convinced himself that Sporus could be more than a servant. He could be the living reflection of what had been lost. From that moment, Sporus's life was no longer his own. He was given a new name, Sabina, echoing Poppaea herself. Attendants began preparing him for a role he had never chosen. Seamstresses crafted gowns of silk designed to soften his figure. Jewelers adorned him with pieces that had once belonged to Poppaea, each ornament a weighty reminder of the woman he was meant to replace. The transformation was not only in clothing. Court tutors instructed him in the manners of an empress. He was taught how to move with poise, how to carry his hands, how to walk with elegance. His voice was guided into softer tones. Hairdressers curled and arranged his hair in intricate styles that demanded hours of work each day. Painters and attendants applied cosmetics to his face, shaping him into an image that was no longer his own. Every morning, Sporus awoke to a reflection that grew more distant from the boy he had once been. Each lesson erased a little more of his identity, replacing it with a carefully constructed mask. To Nero, this was not cruelty, but devotion. He believed he had found a way to restore Poppaea. To Sporus, it was a silent captivity, one in which he was expected to smile, to obey, and to exist as the echo of a woman he had never known. And when Nero judged the transformation complete, he announced what few dared believe possible: Rome would witness another imperial wedding.
In the spring of 67 AD, Nero staged a wedding that astonished even a city accustomed to spectacle. The grand hall of the palace was draped with silks and garlands of flowers, illuminated by thousands of oil lamps that flickered like stars against marble walls. Musicians played songs of celebration, while servants poured wine and carried platters of delicacies from across the empire. To an outsider, it might have seemed like a moment of joy, a new chapter for Rome. But every guest understood the truth. The bride was Sporus, now called Sabina, dressed in the jewels and garments once worn by Poppaea. The emperor had declared that this boy, transformed and adorned, was now his empress. Senators, generals, and courtiers stood in silence, their faces carefully arranged in masks of happiness, for to show discomfort was to risk ruin. The ceremony followed the ancient rites of Roman marriage. Hands were clasped, vows exchanged, sacred bread broken, documents signed. Every gesture was performed as if this were any other imperial union. Yet beneath the surface ran a current of unease. The most powerful man in the world had bound himself to a shadow, a reflection created to soothe his grief. When the vows were spoken, when the music swelled, Nero beamed with triumph. To him, Poppaea had returned. To Sporus, the moment marked the loss of whatever remained of his old life. He was now not simply a companion, but the Empress of Rome in name, expected to live the role every hour of every day. From that moment on, Sporus sat beside Nero at feasts, appeared with him in public, and was addressed as though he truly were Poppaea. The court played along, some with skill, others with trembling unease, but all understanding that survival required silence. What had begun as grief had now become theater, and the empire itself was forced to watch.
In the year 67 AD, Nero turned his gaze eastward. Convinced that his true genius was not in governing but in performance, he traveled to Greece to take part in festivals and competitions. There he sang, acted, and even drove chariots, demanding prizes for every appearance. To his mind, these victories would secure a legacy greater than any conquest of war. And at his side was Sporus, dressed as Empress, introduced to foreign guests who looked on with polite confusion and quiet astonishment. Yet while Nero basked in the applause of Greek audiences, unrest spread across his empire. In Spain and Gaul, governors raised their own standards of rebellion. The treasury groaned under the weight of endless luxuries and spectacles. Soldiers, once loyal, began to murmur. Senators, weary of humiliation, gathered in secret to plot his removal. By 68 AD, the tide could no longer be turned. The Praetorian Guard, sworn to protect him, abandoned their oath. The Senate denounced him. The streets of Rome, once filled with cheers at his games, now buzzed with rumors of his downfall. Nero fled the city with only a handful of attendants. Among them was Sporus, still bound to him, still drawn into the unraveling of the reign that had begun with so much promise. They took shelter in a quiet villa on the outskirts of Rome. Inside those walls, the emperor's moods swayed like a pendulum. One moment he dreamed of raising new armies, of returning in triumph. The next he seemed lost in despair, rehearsing words for an ending he could not avoid. At last, the silence of the villa was broken. The Senate had declared him no longer fit to rule, and soldiers were closing in. Faced with abandonment on every side, Nero chose to leave life behind. Ancient accounts say his final words were not of empire or conquest, but of his art, lamenting that the world would never truly understand him. With Nero gone, the empire stumbled toward chaos, and Sporus, the boy who had been transformed into an empress, found no freedom in his master's absence. Instead, he became a prize in the eyes of others, a living symbol of decadence and tragedy, passed from one hand of power to another.
The fall of Nero did not end Sporus's ordeal. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new chapter filled with uncertainty and danger. In the shifting tides of Roman politics, Sporus became both valuable and vulnerable. His presence was a reminder of Nero's excesses, but also a trophy for those who wished to display their connection to the past. In the months that followed, powerful men took Sporus into their households. Each treated him as Nero had, not as himself, but as the image of Poppaea. He was paraded, renamed, and forced to continue the role he had never chosen. The boy's identity, already fragile, was now further dissolved into the games of politics. The end came under Emperor Vitellius. Known for his cruelty and indulgence, Vitellius planned a spectacle in the arena. He intended to use Sporus in a performance that would humiliate him before thousands, turning his tragic life into public entertainment. The thought of such a fate was unbearable. Sporus, who had endured years of transformation, performance, and captivity, finally made his own choice. Rather than suffer one last humiliation, he decided to leave life on his own terms. Ancient writers tell us he was no more than 20 years old. In his death, Sporus reclaimed something that had been denied to him in life, the ability to choose for himself. His story is remembered not simply as a tale of cruelty and excess, but as a reminder of the human cost of unchecked power. Behind the marble halls and the golden crowns were lives like his, fragile and forgotten, shaped by forces they could not control. Sporus's short life echoes across the centuries as both tragedy and testimony. Tragedy because his identity was stolen and reshaped to satisfy the grief of an emperor. Testimony because in the end he asserted his final act of freedom. His story reminds us that history is not only about emperors and armies, but also about the quiet suffering of those whose voices were silenced, yet whose shadows still linger in the memory of time.